I don't want to sound alarmist, but you just told me you're two young guys that are thinking about having kids or having a family, and that's wonderful. But, right now you have about a 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 chance that your child will have some sort of diagnosis. Um, that should be scary, right? And, we are literally facing a childhood epidemic that's been going on and coming on over the past 30 years, and it's only accelerating. And to me, children are our greatest resource. And now we see this epidemic of adult mental health issues. And so to me, I don't think there's a more important social problem of our time. And we have a lot of social problems right now, but I think this is the number one problem. And almost anybody that knows anything will tell you that it's primarily lifestyle driven, and therefore it can be changed, and it's also preventable in some way or another.
Dr. Melillo, welcome to the Book Thinkers Life-Changing Books podcast. There are so many amazing places that we could start, but I'd love to understand how your wife, Carolyn, influenced you into learning more about autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and all the other neurological disorders in the 90s.
Well, listen, my wife is the smartest person I know. And, women, I think, have a certain instinct, especially when it comes to children. But, I was in my practice, and I was in my practice for 10 years. And was always on neurology and rehabilitation. But I didn't work a lot with kids at the time. But I did have 3 small children at home. And I was often getting home late at nights, as I'm sure you young guys do when you're, working hard as a young man. And came home one day, it was around 1995, and there was a woman sitting at the kitchen table with my wife, and she was crying. And my wife introduced me and said that she had met her at a fundraiser she had for an organization she started to raise money for kids with ADHD and other types of developmental issues. And she was frustrated because she had tried everything, all the traditional psychological and medication approaches, and none of it seemed to work for her. And so my wife knew I knew a lot about neurology. I knew a lot about diet and nutrition. I knew a lot of more kind of cutting edge rehabilitation tools. And so she said, why don't you come and speak with him? Maybe he can give you an idea on other things you might be able to try. So I walked in, and there's this woman, and, I understood my wife, and I said, I took her aside and I said, I see what you're trying to do with this woman. That's great, but I don't really know a lot about ADHD, and I don't really have a lot of extra time, if you haven't noticed. So do you really want me to take this on? And she said, listen, this woman needs help. And she said, and I just have this feeling that this is something you're supposed to do. Like, you're supposed to do something with this. And every time I tell that story, I still get emotional. I remember it. And so I said, okay, so I started doing some research into it. And interestingly, like the next day, I heard a statistic on the radio that said the use of Ritalin in the United States had increased from 200 to 250% between 1990 and 95, and nobody knew why. So that caught my attention, like, wow, okay, this is obviously a problem. And then I went to a couple of days later to a parent-teacher meeting for my older son, and I sat down. It was really one of the first ones I had. He was in first grade, and the teacher right off the bat said, I don't know how to say this, but I think your son might have ADHD or something like that. He's very bright, very talented, but he can't sit still. He's always moving around when everybody else in the class is sitting. And so now I felt, wow, okay. Now I felt, kind of a little bit embarrassed as a professional who taught clinical neurology, and I didn't really know, I didn't see this in my own sons, and a teacher was telling me this. And then I also felt bad as a parent, as most parents do. I felt in some way I was to blame because I wasn't there enough or whatever. But then I heard my wife saying to me, I think you're supposed to do something with this. And I really believe in those types of signs and things like that. And I kind of caught my breath and said, okay. And my first question that popped into my head is, well, what is it? What is ADHD? What's actually happening in the brain because I knew a lot about the brain and neurology already. And for me to try to figure out, okay, what can I do to help my own son or Denise's son or somebody else, I needed to understand what it was. And that's really where it started for me.
I love hearing that story. It gives me goosebumps just like you rehashing that. So thank you so much for sharing. Now, what led you to discovering the Functional Disconnection Syndrome, FDS? Like, you go from, okay, I need to learn about this stuff. How long did it take you to learn this stuff? Were you able to help your son out? Like, what was the process there?
Yeah, so I jumped into well. First thing I did was I went to college. I tried the easy way out, right? And I said, okay, well, let me go to somebody who knows the answer to that question, like what is actually happening, and then I can try to figure out if I can do something about it. And I went to people that I thought would know, colleagues of mine, pediatric neurologists, pediatricians, psychologists, neuropsychologists, and I asked them the question, and each one of them really said, I really don't know what it is. Might have something to do with the frontal lobe or dopamine, but really not sure. But I don't think there's anything you can do about it. And I said, okay, well, you don't know what it is, but you're absolutely sure we can't do anything about it. That doesn't make much sense to me. So I realized I needed to do the research myself. So I literally started going to different medical school libraries. At the time, remember, it was the 90s. The internet wasn't a big thing yet. But the 90s was the decade of the brain, as it was declared by Bill Clinton. So all this new brain research and all of these tools to look at the brain in real time, like fMRI and SPECT scans and PET scans, and all these tools were coming out that we could look at the brain in real time, which didn't exist before. And so it really started to change the way people were looking at brain issues and mental health issues, rather than by looking at lesions like, some sort of damage or stroke or a problem in one area. It became really much more apparent that it was really more of a communication problem. And the concept of functional connectivity was really starting to make a big way in the research, that the way that different networks communicate with one another is really the primary problem. It's not actually damage or injury to the brain. And the idea of chemical imbalances was already becoming kind of passé at that point. So I dove into that and looked at, all the research I could in regard to functional connectivity, what was going on with ADHD, and why was there this kind of interruption of communication between areas of the brain.
Yeah, when I first read your book, there were so many light bulbs that went off in my head. I was like, whoa. I had, growing up, I had all those little issues too that they didn't know what to do with. And it's really interesting that even in 2024, we are still trying to look at it almost through this chemical lens, it feels like. Why
Right.
is that?
Why is it? Because, we still, even though, we in the United States are fortunate that we have a healthcare system that is very diverse, that we have the most innovative healthcare in the world, without a doubt, nothing else is even close, because of people outside of the traditional medical approach, but even people within the medical approach that are willing to step out of the box. But, the traditional medical model still is the model. And obviously that's influenced heavily by pharmaceutical companies. And so in medical school, they primarily learn a lot about the biochemistry of the body and looking at infectious disease, which is really where it all kind of started. And, so they're still very heavily biochemically based, that they may go out and do what we call functional medicine, where they're looking at things like diet or nutrition or supplements or other types of innovative treatment, but it's still looking at things biochemically. But in the brain and in brain research, it's really been moving for the last few decades away from a chemical model and more through a physiological model. Again, electrical, chemical, but electrical, and even a physics, like looking at the physics of the brain and how things communicate and how networks form and all of that type of thing. So we're still stuck a lot in that old medical model, and that's still an important thing. And even if we go into diet and nutrition, we're still looking at things chemically. But really, when we're talking about the brain, it's about stimulating the brain and really using more rehabilitation principles in the brain itself.
So if you could go back in time to that parent-teacher conference with your first grader and you were to receive the same information, hey, really bright, really intelligent, but just can't sit still, how would you approach that conversation differently today? How would you respond to that teacher?
Well, first of all, I'd want to know more about that aspect of it. But, at that point, she didn't have any sort of solution or anything. So, for me, like if a parent now is faced with that same thing, if they're going in there and if they say, what's the first thing you should do? The first thing I should do is get my book, Disconnected Kids, because what I did from that was, again, no one could really explain to me what it was. And she had no idea, obviously. And so I went and dove into books and scientific literature. I started reading a lot of books and I read so many papers to try to understand it. And I reached out to researchers that were doing some innovative stuff. And all of that I put into my book, Disconnected Kids, which was really designed to be a manual for a parent. It was like, okay, what is actually happening in your child's brain? What is the real deal? And that's where, understanding the imbalances between the right and left hemisphere and how they present with different symptoms, because just putting a label out there doesn't really say much. Like you can have a left brain deficit and be diagnosed with one type of ADHD, which is typically what we call, type 1 ADHD, or you could have a right brain delay with overactivity of the left, and that would be maybe type 2 or type 3. So again, just throwing a name or a label out doesn't really tell you what the actual issue is. And if you don't know what the issue is, you really don't know what to do about it.
Now, is there a way, and I know you allude to this in your book, you talk about it in your book, but is there a way for anybody listening today that they can get ahead of a neurological disorder like ADHD from the start? Nick is actually about to have his first child. I have 3 kids. So we're very much in this world of ADHD and neurological disorders. And I have a lot of friends who have similar problems. So what can somebody do? What can a parent do to kind of get ahead of these things?
Really good question. And there's 2 things. One is, a number of years ago, my nephew, who was my business partner in at one point, he was a young guy, graduated from Penn. He had a lot of bright Ivy League school, Wall Street type friends, and they would spend their summers out on Long Island on the Hamptons. And he came back one weekend and he said to me, a lot of my friends were discussing this weekend that they don't want to have kids because they see the statistics on autism and what's happening and they're afraid. And I said, wow, okay. And they're choosing not to have children. I said, wow, okay, well, that's not a really good answer, right? So maybe I should, look and write something for people as far as what can be done that might be able to mitigate the risk or identify your risk of having a child with some sort of disability and be able to mitigate that risk before you have a child. And, for years, because I work with many families and kids with autism, parents would come to me and say, hey, we want to have another child but we're a little concerned, is there something that maybe we could have done differently? So my third book was really about what causes it. Why are we seeing this epidemic rise? What are some of the environmental and genetic factors, or what we call epigenetic factors, that can be done preconception? And there's a lot out there. So that book called Autism, the Scientific Truth, came out, I think, in 2016, and it's pretty comprehensive. It's the first book that was really written from a preventative perspective. And so that's one thing. I tell people you should read that book. And the bottom line is it's about kind of training your body. I tell people when I did 2 New York City marathons, and before I did that, I trained for a year. And that was a marathon, right? So before you have a child, you should really train your body for like at least a year in preparation. And that doesn't always work out. Obviously, people get pregnant spontaneously, but if you're in that age group, you should be aware of that, and you should know that there are definitely risk factors that you can lower. You can have a direct impact. You can't say you can prevent something, but we definitely can say we can lower your risk of having a child in measurable ways. The second thing is, when you're talking about, getting ahead of it once the child is born, really looking at these early milestones, especially motor milestones, is so important. There's a lot of my work, and this is really the new thing. So when you do another edition of a book, it needs to be at least 25% difference. It's really like doing a whole nother book, right? So this is the third edition. And what we added was a whole new chapter on something called retained primitive reflexes, which has really been my focus of research over the past 5 to 10 years. And especially last year, we published about 7 or 8 papers alone just on that topic. And that is all about, what's happening during that first year of development. And if anything goes off the rails a little bit, that's a big red flag, and you can intervene right away, and you can put it right back on track. And that can save you years of difficulty and pain.
I think it's so cool that the thing that I learned in your book that I thought was really awesome, I was reading through it and I'm like, oh man, what if you have a kid that has ADHD or autism and they are so behind in all their developmental milestones, but then you said you can actually catch up pretty quickly. So
Yes.
Why is that the case?
Yeah. There's nature is an amazing thing, and the brain is unbelievable, right? I mean, we have a capacity, something known as neuroplasticity, which means that the brain has the ability to change and reshape itself and grow until really we die. I mean, we never lose that ability. Of course, it's highest when you're a child, but we never lose it. And so I think that the nature of it, again, when I first started looking into this, the concept that jumped out at me when I first started reading papers on ADHD was something called unevenness of skills, meaning that kids with ADHD and other disabilities weren't delayed or deficient in everything. In fact, they were often very gifted. And that's true. Whenever I work with somebody now, and when you even see a young person complaining that they have ADHD or some other thing, they're usually very gifted in an area. They may be very talented in one thing or another. And so there's this imbalance in the brain that right from the beginning, and I recognized when I started looking into it, that like everything that somebody with traditional ADHD does well are left brain dominant skills, and everything that they struggle with are really right brain dominant skills. And that we could really identify it that way, and that we could do things to change that. But the idea that looking at early development and trying to do that as early as possible and intervene was really very, very important, that there was never a point when you couldn't change it. And as I was going along, I read some early work from some pioneers who had started just doing some basic stuff with sensory stimulation and trying to really rehabilitate kids with brain injuries. And they had found that once they started to really do a decent program with them, that some of these kids, their brain would seem to grow at like 300% normal size until it caught up. So that, because your genetics and determine what your size should be and your age. And the good thing is that, you can, if you get your body back on track and you get your brain growing, it pretty much kind of zooms up to the size that it's supposed to be. And so the trajectory, and that's what we're trying to do. We're just trying to change the developmental trajectory where it may be a little flat in most kids and there's some maturational delay. And by changing that angle, we can get an accelerated growth so that they can catch up. And again, because they're coming from a standpoint that they're actually gifted to begin with, that they may even shoot beyond where other people and other kids their age is and really get to where they're supposed to be.
Yeah, this is fascinating. It's more fascinating too because, like Luke mentioned, my first kid is due in early October, and what my wife and I are doing right now is every night we're supplementing a little bit of that TV time with reading books about early childhood development and raising children, because we're newbies and we want to be, as well researched as we can be. And I'm fascinated for my physical copy of Disconnected Kids, the third edition, to show up in a couple of weeks here, because following that first year, sort of the developmental milestones and making sure that we're on track, I'll definitely be doing that and providing a testimonial for the book. Now, speaking of testimonials, one of your most famous is the story with Kevin James. And so I'd love to have you share that with everybody, because prior to the two of us ever getting connected, I heard Kevin on Joe Rogan talking about you. And then when we met, I'm like, are you the same guy that I just heard him talk about? So tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, so Kevin, came to me because he had some issues with his older daughter, who was on the autism spectrum, very high functioning, and again, a brilliant girl. I mean, absolutely amazing artist. I mean, she was writing a book. It was almost like the Lord of the Rings. I mean, her own language. It was really amazing. But, she had a lot of issues that she struggled with. She couldn't sleep. She had terrible eczema. And she also had a lot, really bad OCD. And, she struggled obviously socially. And, but she really developed these tics. And the tics were really very difficult. I mean, they came on all of a sudden, and they were violent and aggressive, and they were full body. And she would hit herself in the head and scream. And literally, I had known Kevin because he had consulted me before, and his wife had found my book, and we had talked. But then these tics came out, and he reached out to me and he said, we went to this emergency room, and my wife asked the doctors what could be done, and they literally laughed at her and said, "What do you think we're going to do for these tics?" And so he said, "So you're kind of my last hope. I'm going to bring her, is there anything you can do?" I said, "Yeah, bring her in." And, she has the type of profile neurologically. We did an exam, and we identified that there were certain areas and networks on the right side that were very underdeveloped or immature, but areas on the left were so overactive. And she had a tendency to get certain infections. And this time, and she didn't really feel it. A lot of people on the autism spectrum, they may not feel their body. And because the brain regulates everything, it has a big impact on your immune system as well. I mean, autoimmune issues, chronic infections, many of them are founded in imbalances in the brain itself. And we don't think that way, but this is functional neuroimmunology is a big area of research now, and an area where we're going. And so it triggered these tics in her, and they were really violent. He brought them in, and we really started working on her primary issue to just kind of quiet down the left brain, bring up the right, get rid of these primitive reflexes, do all the different tools that we do. We started modifying her diet to try to reduce inflammation, to help her with the eczema as well, and to get her to sleep. And after about 3 or 4 weeks, I mean, she just walked in one day and bam, they just stopped. And so he was just incredibly grateful for that. And, for her too. I mean, she was grateful for it as well. And it was really an interesting story. And he said to me, as a parent, he realized it was so scary for him what he was going through, and they didn't have any hope. And he said, I want to be able to help other parents. And so we've talked about doing a fundraiser and being able to develop a not-for-profit research institute to do more of my work and research it. And in the interim, he said, I don't want to come out and tell people and say a lot because I don't want to seem like I'm promoting anything. He said, but sooner or later, I'm going to be on somebody's show and I'm going to be talking about something. And I knew him and Joe Rogan were good friends. And he said, but when I get that opportunity, I'm going to let the world know, because people need to know that there's hope. And that's why if you listen to that interview on Joe Rogan, he kind of specifically directed it towards, he started talking about his kids and his daughter. And he took that there because he wanted so badly to make sure that he brought this out, and that, and he's a total man of his word. I mean, Kevin said he was going to do it, and and he did it. But that was really great. It's got a great response, and his daughter's doing fabulous now.
I love that story, and similar to Nick, that was the first interaction I had with you, at least knowing about you, was through Kevin James. So that very powerful, and Joe Rogan obviously has a huge reach as well. Now, speaking of hope, I love how you talk about it not being a genetic problem. So can you maybe speak to that, and what are some of the root causes for maybe the right brain deficiency versus the left brain deficiency, and just unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, this is something that is very confusing for people because, we always hear that that these are genetic, and most people don't know what that means. And even like, especially in the autism world, you always hear that these are genetic disorders, and people think that there must be some mutated gene or damaged gene. And the truth is, with genetic disorders, true mutations like Down syndrome or something, we really don't, there's not a lot you can do to change that gene. But there's no mental health disorder out there that is due to a single gene mutation. Not one, right? So people need to know that. When we talk about genetics, there's something called epigenetics, which means that environmental factors, things that are happening in your body, inflammation, the way you use your body, the way you use your brain, what you eat, do you sleep? All of these things can create different molecules called methyl molecules. And these methyl molecules can attach to parts of our gene and can inhibit the gene from being expressed, so that it can look like if a gene is damaged or not there, or a gene is just shut off, the end product looks the same or looks similar. The difference is that you can turn the gene back on by modifying diet or exercise, or doing the right type of activity or stimulation, or changing your lifestyle and your environment. And when we look at even things like autism, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, ADHD, there is a trait that is more predisposed to that. So that is something that is also, it's genetic, but it's a genetic trait. So for instance, like people that are on the autism spectrum, they may have what we also refer to as an intellect trait. In the family, there's somebody named Simon Baron-Cohen. He's a big autism researcher out of Cambridge, showed that in the families of people with autism, there's a much higher percentage of people that are mathematicians or physicists, or are, professors or lawyers or doctors, or work in the IT industry. And in fact, he showed anywhere in the world where there's a cluster of people that work in IT that are like basically software engineers, there's an explosion of autism in those areas. And, that's not a genetic mutation, but there's a trait. And the trait is, the way I look at it, is these are people that are very left brain dominant in their thinking style. They are, more logical. I mean, people will say, I'm a logical person. I think kind of, linearly and sequentially, and I look at every detail, and I read, a manual when I get it. I'm going to read it before I do it. And, these people tend to be really good in math and engineering and physics and science, and they gravitate towards that. And that's the way that they think. And they may struggle a little bit with some of their right brain skills, where they may not be the most social. They may not always pick up on the joke. They may not be able to see the big picture as well as somebody else. They may not be as in touch with their own body or their own emotions as much. But, they're very high functioning, bright, brilliant people. And this is a trait. Now, bipolar is another trait that is more what we call a creativity trait. And these are people that, that tend to be more in the artistic, creative world, that tend to be more right brain dominant in their thinking style. And they may, see the big picture really well, but not be good with details. They may feel emotions very strongly, but maybe too much. They may be over emotional, and they may be overreactive emotionally. They may struggle with some left brain skills. They may be dyslexic. They may struggle with basic reading or spelling or math, or may have had trouble with memorizing facts or details. But they're really good at reading people, and they're really good at, understanding intuitively what to do, and they get these gut feelings. So there are these genetic traits that are advantages. But the way traits work is that, too much of the trait can then lead, as you get an advanced version of a trait, you also have a vulnerability on the other side. And that vulnerability can lead to some sort of label or disorder or disability.
That was a great explanation. I have two final questions for you as we get towards the end of the podcast today. My first is this: if I think you've done a great job at explaining the case for reading this third edition of Disconnected Kids, but I'm curious if somebody's still on the fence, if they're not quite sure whether or not to head over to Amazon or their favorite bookseller and buy the book, what message do you have for them?
Well, I don't want to sound alarmist, but you just told me you're two young guys that are thinking about having kids or having a family, and that's wonderful. But, right now you have about a 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 chance that your child will have some sort of diagnosis. That should be scary, right? And, we are literally facing a childhood epidemic that's been going on and coming on over the past 30 years, and it's only accelerating. And to me, children are our greatest resource. And now we see this epidemic of adult mental health issues. And so to me, I don't think there's a more important social problem of our time. And we have a lot of social problems right now, but I think this is the number one problem. And almost anybody that knows anything will tell you that it's primarily lifestyle driven, and therefore it can be changed, and it's also preventable in some way or another. And, there's nothing that is more challenging. I work with parents and families that literally fly all over the world. I mean, this week alone in my center in New York, we have people from Australia, from Jakarta, from Brazil, from Milan, from Venezuela, literally all over the world. And they'll do, because parents will do anything to help their children. And after the fact, it's very hard. It's harder than, the further you go down the road. And so the earlier you can identify if there is something going on and then change that, because that's the one thing, is that it can be changed. In almost every instance, we can significantly change or even eliminate these problems. And the other thing is that if they do develop a problem, I can almost guarantee you that they're very gifted, and that they may never be able to fully tap into that gift unless we create, balance in their brain or eliminate things that are holding them back, like these retained primitive reflexes. And, what do we want for our children? When you have children, all you're going to want is, you want them to become the best version of themselves. You want them to be happy, and you want them to go out and have friends and be social and be able to form good relationships. And more we see that impacted today. And it's really heartbreaking to see it. But the good news is that we can change it. At any point, we can change it. But the earlier we can intervene, the better. So, it's just, this is something that you really need to educate yourself even before you get pregnant or early on, so that you can create the best environment. And then after the fact, you can always intervene, but the earlier you learn about it and the earlier you can look out, because like I said, if you just watch these early milestones, and the problem is that the average pediatrician isn't telling people this. They're telling them that actually the milestones don't matter much anymore. I mean, the CDC, during COVID came out with a statement actually saying that crawling isn't a milestone anymore. And so there's a lot of mixed signals out there. And I'm telling you that these milestones are hugely important. They're the first sign that your child might have something going off and might need some help. And it's also the earliest way we can intervene.
I mean, this has been an incredible interview, and I don't think it's alarmist. I think it's realist, and I'm happy that you're out here promoting this message. I kind of had three major takeaways today. One was the marathon metaphor. I can't believe, when you put it that way, that people would prepare a year or more to run a race, but they won't prepare to have a child, and that child will live for 70, 80, 90 years as a result of what you do before you get pregnant. So that was great. Number two is that the milestones matter, and we're getting a lot of conflicting information, but they matter a lot. And then number three is we have control. You know, we can change things. If you pay attention, you can readjust, and the brain has neuroplasticity and can accelerate and catch up. And that's a wonderful message. My final question for you today is about your tattoos. So I'm curious. Yeah, can you explain any significance with your tattoos? As somebody who is covered in them myself, I always love to ask.
Yeah, the idea of wearing your heart on your sleeve, right? So this is literal in our case. And for me, it was about, really the things that are important to me and that drive me. And so I have, it starts out with on my shoulder with the Big Bang. I'm really into physics. I'm into human evolution and brain evolution. And I'm into, I like art. My wife's an artist. And so combining those things together. So we started out with, the Big Bang, the Higgs boson, the God particle, kind of the beginning of it all in the universe and coming out. And I'm a big fan of Einstein, E=mc², but it comes down into the cosmos. But then what's really cool is I have the picture going up here and here is actually the Sistine Chapel that Michelangelo painted of God with Adam. There's been a number of scientific papers that have actually written that the image of God sitting there is actually Michelangelo drew it as the brain and the brainstem. And that what's really cool is that if you look at where his hand is coming out of the prefrontal cortex, which is what really makes humans unique, and he's giving it through fine motor touch to Adam. So it's kind of like Michelangelo knew somehow. I mean, he did do dissection of human bodies. So he knew that the prefrontal cortex was unique, and that kind of that was something like God in us is really that. And then I have skulls that represent the different stages of human evolution, and then this right here is the 6 layers of what the brain looks like under a microscope. So I have all of those kind of as part of it. I have a line from one of my daughter's songs. She's a very good singer-songwriter in Nashville. She's awesome. I have a drawing that my son drew. He's an incredible artist. So I have like my family over. I have my wife's name 3 times. She told me I had to have her name 3 times somehow on my body because 3 is her favorite number. And my wife loves tattoos, so that's also a big influence.
Oh, I love it. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Like I said, this has been a great conversation, and I know Luke will bring it home here for us in a minute. But I can't wait to read the book cover to cover with my wife and implement and pay attention because, like you said, children are our greatest resource, and I can't wait to have a bunch of them.
Yeah, I think the last thing that I want to say is that, what we know now is that, almost all adult mental health issues start in childhood. So this is not just a book for children. It's about brain development and everything. 20% of children have some sort of clinical diagnosis, and 20% of adults have a clinical mental health diagnosis. That's not a coincidence. It's basically the same population that never got help. Because if you don't deal with it, medication and most of the treatments out there can be helpful, but they're really just managing symptoms. They're not dealing with the core issue. And so I think a lot of parents might recognize themselves in these books as well and really understand when you start looking at the right and left brain and how it works. The reaction I get from people from the very beginning was always like, wow, this makes so much sense. It explains my child. Like, how did you know my child? But it also explains me. Like, okay, now I get it. I understand. And so I think it's something that is not just about childhood. It's about brain development. And that's what we see even in adult issues. And if you don't deal with it as a child, they're going to struggle with it for the rest of their life.
Yeah, reading through your book, I can't even tell you how many quotes I sent my wife over, but I was like, oh, this is my problem. Oh, this is what happened. So I 100% agree that it's not just for your kids, but it's also for yourself. It's understanding your brain better. And you do such a great job at making it in practical language that anybody can understand. I've never considered myself a very smart person, but when I read through your book, I did feel, I was like, okay, I get this. This makes sense. So I thank you for putting that time into that book and doing such a good job at getting it down to a level that even somebody like me can understand. All right, I have two more questions, Dr. Melillo, and then I'll let you go. The first is, where can people go to find out a little bit more about you and learn about all the stuff that you're doing? And we'll link all that stuff in the show notes.
Okay, so my website is drrobertmelillo.com. But I'm very active on Instagram. I have almost 800,000 followers at this point, and I'm putting a lot of information. And we get so many good stories and info from moms and from kids around the world that we put out there. So I think it's a real educational resource to see what we do on Instagram. Again, that's also at Dr. Robert Melillo, and Facebook, of course. Other resources, obviously, are my books. There are several books. Disconnected Kids, this is the third edition, but I have also Reconnected Kids, Autism, the Scientific Truth, Disconnected Kids, Diet and Nutrition Plan. And then I have a novel that I wrote about this called Einstein's Desk that I wrote with my brother that's pretty cool. And then I also have a textbook called Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood and Evolutionary Perspective. My wife and I also did a web series that is on a new streaming network called Your Home TV. It was started by Kathy Ireland and other people. And that is a show called Disconnected Kids, Reconnected Families. And we have almost 4 million views in 1 year on that show. And it's a pretty cool, it's 2 seasons of a web series where we show what this looks like when we bring it into someone's home and how to be able to adopt these different lifestyle things and, do some of the activities that we talk about in the book.
Well, that is so amazing. Thank you so much again for putting all this information out there. Okay, this is my final question that I'd like to ask all of our guests. I can't wait to hear your answer. It's this. You pass away and all the information, the books, courses, TV shows, everything disappears, but you can leave the world with a single piece of advice. What would it be?
Wow. In regard to like my work?
It can be, yes. It can be that, okay. Or it can be very practical, whatever you feel.
Yeah, I think what we need to know more of is that we need to understand that the brain is the key to it all. It's the key to everything. Understanding the brain is the key to unlocking the universe. That all health really, stems from the brain. And I think that, when we look at healthcare, mental health and everything, happiness, forming relationships, all of it, it really starts with the brain and understanding the brain as a functional, dynamic organ that we can change and we can understand, and that many of the principles in the universe are embedded in the brain itself. So I would just say that understanding the brain and being able to do things to change the brain in real ways is the single most important thing I think we can do for society at all levels.
So incredibly powerful, and I 100% agree. Dr. Melillo, thank you again for being on our podcast. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you, guys.